A new NBC News poll shows Biden's approval numbers tapering off. The poll shows 42% approve of the president's job performance, while 54% disapprove. Meanwhile, the poll found that 71% of people believe the country is headed down the wrong track, while just 22% believe it's headed in the right direction. And tomorrow in Virginia, we'll see if Democrats can chalk up a victory for the former governor, Democrat Terry McAuliffe. The Washington Post illustrated the different groups of voters and how they perceive McAuliffe and Republican challenger Glenn Youngkin, men versus women, younger versus older voters, college educated versus those without degrees, and vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Urban voters support McAuliffe by 63% to 37%. Rural and small town voters back Youngkin by 61% to 33%. And in the newest division in politics, those who have had at least one shot of a coronavirus vaccine, a significant majority of likely voters, support McAuliffe by 14 points. Those who have not received even one vaccine dose back Youngkin by 77 points. It's important to note that Virginia has one of the highest vaccine rates in the country, with 71% of the population having received at least one dose. The Hill's Julia Manchester has been following the race closely and joins us to discuss, along with White House reporter for Real Clear Politics, Philip Wegman. Welcome to you both.
Good morning.
So, Julia, what should we expect to see? We're heading into this very, very, very close governor's race. Obviously, there was a bit of controversy, which we covered on the show on Friday with this tiki torch stunt. What do the polls tell us, and what should we be looking for?
Well, I think the polls tell us that we're in for a very late night tomorrow. It's going to be a nail-biter for a lot of political watchers, Republicans and Democrats looking at this race. It's really a bellwether ahead of the midterms. But, speaking of that tiki torch stunt, and how you're seeing Democrats, in particular Democratic allies, trying to bring former President Trump into this race, this morning alone has been a bit of a breaking news situation in the governor's race. You saw former President Trump sending out a statement just a few minutes ago saying that the mainstream media has tried to paint him and Glenn Youngkin as being at odds with each other, when in fact they quote unquote get along very well. And he says that they agree with the same policies. Now, President Trump is very correct in that they are on the same page with a number of policies. Glenn Youngkin is a Republican, obviously has taken a page out of the Republican playbook, which involves President Trump quite a bit. But it's interesting to see how Glenn Youngkin has really distanced himself from Donald Trump, really keeping him at an arm's length. Sometime today or this evening, President Trump will be holding a tele-rally for Youngkin. As far as we know, Youngkin will not be in attendance. Instead, he's holding a number of get out the vote rallies throughout Virginia, with his last one in Loudoun County, a Parents Matter rally. But just a couple hours before that, you're seeing Terry McAuliffe doing a get out the vote rally in Fairfax, Virginia, and he's going to condemn President Trump's endorsement and tele-rally for Youngkin, which he's done a number of times before. So I'm really interested to see whether this Democratic strategy of invoking President Trump will work when President Trump is not on the ballot.
Yeah, right. So as you mentioned earlier, former President Trump has weighed in this morning in the race. So he wrote in part, quote, "The reason the fake news and perverts are working overtime is to try and convince people that do not like each other, and therefore my great and unprecedented Make America Great Again base will not show up to vote. And Terry McAuliffe is a low-life politician who lies, cheats, and steals. He was a terrible high-tax governor and would be, if elected, an even worse governor once again." So Philip, obviously, Youngkin wants to keep Trump at bay a little bit. I think correctly surmising that, he has, with the rising salience perhaps of some of these education and school issues, he has more of a shot at independents or Democrats and has that shot right as long as Trump is not in the picture.
And for a long time, the question going into this race, at least for the last couple of weeks, is whether or not you could have a Republican who could make populist culture war arguments without the baggage that comes from Trump's populism. And for a long time, you had analysts of this race saying that the Virginia contest was going to come down to a match between the two presidents, right? You had Youngkin and Trump was a stand-in for him. You had McAuliffe and Biden was a stand-in for him. The problem with that narrative, though, is that for a long time, Youngkin has successfully managed to keep the former president at arm's length. He's a sort of Mitt Romney-looking guy who's pretty polite, doesn't have the same fire and brimstone as the former president does. Things are complicated by what's happening today. What Julia just laid out, and maybe it's possible for Youngkin to boost his numbers with former Trump supporters while this town hall doesn't take away from some of the suburban support that he gets. That's clearly what they're hoping for. But I think that initial narrative, which was this is going to be sort of a contest between the two presidents, that doesn't exactly bear out here. I think that the Democrats certainly wish that it would. They would love nothing more than to run against Trump. But what is interesting here is I think that if you take a step back, Democrats, they won their majorities in 2018. Nancy Pelosi went to Democratic candidates and she said, you don't need to always constantly be talking about Trump. You don't need to be talking about Russia. Focus on kitchen table issues. Well, now in the final stretch of things, it is Trump all the way down, and that is the default position of Democrats, and we're going to see whether or not their mileage varies here, or whether or not the threat of Trump or his association with Youngkin is going to be enough to juice their turnout and turn people off from the Republican challenger.
And the narrative that you're getting from this race, both from the conservative media and from the liberal media, seems to be that Republicans are energized and Democrats are not. But early voting data isn't really bearing that out. And intuitively, it doesn't really check out either, because everybody is pissed off in this country, both sides. And polarization means that it increases the salience of an issue on both sides. And so even though that we're hearing more about conservatives, it may be the case that Democrats are going to turn out to vote at high levels, and because Virginia is now such a Democratic heavy state, that they could pull it off on election night. Philip, I'm curious, what do you think the reaction from conservatives will be if after all of this, and with so much confidence going into Tuesday, that it turns out that they actually lose? Will there be voter fraud allegations, or do you
Well, first of all, I want to hit on something you just said, because I think that that's a really important thing that we should put a pin in here. The current narrative is obviously that Republicans are fired up and that they have momentum and they're ready to win this bellwether. But if you take a step back, what we're seeing in 2020 and also in Virginia is that there is polarization such that you might have a voter who in the past was interested in sort of voting for the party out of power, but now with the way things are, it's possible that same voter might just vote party ticket once again. Maybe it's going to turn out Virginia is not the bellwether that we expected, and instead it's not going to be a local political question, it'll be a national one. So that's certainly a possibility, and I think that's an important note to make, because maybe we can revisit that in the future. How are conservatives going to respond to this if they lose? So far, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Youngkin has said that he will honor the results of the election, if he does lose. But there is a big appetite in the base currently that says, if we don't win, that something must have gone wrong. It's always the side that loses that is questioning the referees as they walk out to their cars after the big game. It's not the side that wins. So there could be questions about whether or not everything was to the book. I think that if it's a close race, it's going to be very controversial. Obviously, both sides are already lawyered up, and maybe Julia's more right than she knows. Maybe this won't just be a late Tuesday night. Maybe it'll be a really long, ugly week.
Well, and Julia, real quick, because we're going to have to run in a minute, but are there any early indicators or signs we'll be able to look for so that we won't be, sitting on the edge of our seats for well into the night?
Well, I think a lot of people have been pointing to early voting, and you have Republicans and Democrats really working to drive that early vote this year. Kind of a departure from previous Republican strategy, because early voting has been more of a thing for Democrats in the past. But it's actually down compared to recent years, especially compared to 2020. However, you're going to see a lot of Democrats saying, "Look, it was up in 2020 because that was a presidential year. It was a high stakes general election amid a global pandemic. Of course, it's down this year." So, I think you're going to see a lot of people trying to read the tea leaves when it comes to early voting. But I think it's a little difficult to compare this year's early vote total to past year's early vote total, because I think there's just a general sense of fatigue, really, especially among Democrats right now.
Makes sense. Julia and Philip, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And stay with us. We'll have more Rising right after this.